Fáilte Craobh agus Máitín Waith is Mr. Gearoid O'Machail. I'm a member of the Peadar O'Donnell Forum. And for those in our audience today who are unfamiliar with the work of the forum, our aim is to promote the ideas of socialist republicanism, as best expressed by James Connolly, Liam Mellows, Peadar O'Donnell and co. We're named after Peadar O'Donnell in recognition of his outstanding role as a union organiser, a Republican soldier, an author, an enemy of fascism, a friend of the workers and small farmers, a committed socialist and a lifelong activist for peace and against imperialism. The forum formed in 2012 after a group of socialist and Republican activists from a variety of political backgrounds and organisations throughout Ireland came together by invitation in the Dublin offices of the Communist Party for a series of seminars on class, the state and imperialism. The forum has coalesced around 11 guiding principles, and we campaign on the basis of our manifesto, which is contained within our democratic programme for the 21st century. So that's who we are. And we're going to begin today with a presentation from a neighbour of mine, Dr. Fearghal MacBhloscaidh, de Wonu Dungannon, is Muncher Cholastia Firstja, agus Lector Steyre, Cholastia Wera Fearghal, a will ga lower more scrífa ige. Dilshu Fenians agus Ribbon Men, ga vilas doieg. Fenians and Ribbon Men is an examination of the development of Republican politics in East Tyrone from 1898 to 1918. In 2014, Fearghal produced the first comprehensive and meticulously researched study of County Tyrone during the Irish Revolution. The Irish Revolution, 1912 to 23, Tyrone, gives us a study of a critical region in Ireland during the revolutionary years, offering fresh perspectives on how Tyrone women and men engaged in a range of unionist, nationalist, republican and trade union activities. Fearghal's perspective can be summarised by his conclusion that the partition of Ireland did not rely on the existence of two nations or on fears of religious persecution, but rather on the determination of a Tory political elite which included the Ulster Unionist leaders to preserve imperial interests. By working comprehensively through the evolution of all the main political forces of the era without fear of revisionist condemnation, Fearghal has made a very valuable contribution to our understanding of those revolutionary years, both in Tyrone and indeed across the whole island. Fearghal produces an excellent bilingual blog entitled MacBhloscaidh, dealing with current affairs, history and education. It showcases his academic output in addition to his own contemporary political and cultural commentary. So, Bawailam Falsha Ahur Riv Fearghal MacBhloscaidh, who will now offer a presentation on the War for Independence, a Just War.
Is dógur an Tronfortune is fudging mar vest and Carolina. Say that introduction is probably hopefully going to be as long as the presentation that I'm going to give. So I try and nip into a PowerPoint presentation here. So the Town War, a Just War. What is the basis of this talk? The basis is really twofold. The first is growing up during what Fukuyama called the end of history and studying undergraduate history in Queen's and then postgraduate history in Queen's. I was subject to a barrage of revisionism, which is essentially politically motivated history, which sought to undermine the Republican struggle during the Troubles and implied a retrospective, critical and very dismissive analysis of Republican and working class agency during the Irish Revolution in order to achieve this. This was epitomised by the work of someone like Peter Hart and then David Fitzpatrick. Now, we've moved on in the post-1988 Good Friday Agreement in many respects because the main political agents, groups and parties in Ireland have essentially accepted the principle of consent and Britain's right to interference in Ireland. What has happened is that the way that the decade of commemorations has been conducted and the spirit behind it has been very much informed by the same unionist and British analysis which underpinned revisionism. That is to say, the British state is largely a neutral arbiter in Irish affairs, kind of refereeing between two intransigent and irrational warring tribes. And more importantly, that Republican agency and agency by the working class is inherently irrational and violent. And in the case of the Town War, which is what the volunteers called the struggle for national liberation, was sectarian. That the IRA, and this is what an awful lot of revisionist historians have tried to promote, the IRA carried out a sectarian campaign in Cork. So the commemoration of the decade of the centenaries has very much projected this sort of shared history approach. Shared history between Britain and Ireland, shared history between nationalists and unionists. And while this is all very woolly and nice and, suits the neoliberal agenda and the consensus after Good Friday, it doesn't reflect historical reality. The Town War was a war for national liberation, which was democratically supported, was an aspect of a wider democratic Republican campaign in order to achieve self-determination for the whole Ireland, which had components of social justice and even socialist thought within it that was subverted by the counter-revolution, the institution of partition, which Connolly called the carnival of reaction, quite presciently, and that the way that this decade of commemorations has taken place or has been engineered by the political establishment north and south will face significant challenges now in the next couple of years in terms of addressing what the War of Independence or the Town War was really about. It was a struggle for national liberation against an imperial and colonial power that was not ultimately successful. So, on that rather bleak note, let's go through the main aspects of what I'm going to talk about in this. So, we're going to begin really with the first meeting of Dáil Éireann on the 21st of January 1919, where the Declaration of Independence reaffirms the Republic that's declared outside the GPO on Easter Monday 1916, and where, because the Labour Party had abstained from the 1918 general election, the Labour Party, Thomas Johnson and others, have input into the writing of the democratic programme of the First Dáil, and the Pádraig O'Donnell Forum has produced a democratic programme for the new age, for the next century. So this Declaration of Independence was democratically based. It was ignored by the British. It was ignored in Paris at the peace talks, and the Dáil and 5 other dangerous organisations, such as the GAA and the Gaelic were then banned in September 1919, and the British tried to coerce this democratic movement out of existence. And it's within that framework that the Army of the Republic, the Óglaigh na hÉireann, or what became known as the Irish Republican Army, then engaged in military, in an insurrection, in a campaign of guerrilla warfare. This was not, in revisionist historiography, this is very much decontextualized. It's as if these people are just irrationally violent and bent towards killing people. But this operates within a context of a democratic mandate for a republic and self-determination. Its refusal by imperial powers, namely Britain, but America and France reject, calls at the peace conference, and then the coercion of this democratic mandate by an imperial state, who employ sectarian divisions in Ireland and the partition of the country as a means to secure their own interests in the face of a mass democratic republican movement. Now, the apex of this coercive campaign, the apex of this struggle, in many popular minds, is November 1920, with the bloodiest month, where the Craobh gang are assassinated. This is British intelligence gang are assassinated in Dublin. And then the British forces go into Croke Park and indiscriminately kill civilians in a mass reprisal, and then subsequently that night torture 2 prominent volunteers and dump their bodies. This is Bloody Sunday, which is followed then by the Kilmichael ambush. We'll talk very briefly about these. But the key point here is that before Lloyd George's imposition of the Black and Tans and then subsequently the auxiliaries and the Ulster Special Constabularies, the Irish people had voted again to reconfirm the mandate of Sinn Féin in 1918. They had voted in January 1920 in the urban council elections and in June 1920 in the rural council elections. In spite of the fact that the IRA had already begun its guerrilla campaign, there was a clear expression of democratic support for the Republican government. And the British government ignored this and tried to coerce the Republic out of existence. Now, we will end the talk today with the 11th of July ceasefire in 1921. We'll not go into too much detail about this because I think maybe in subsequent meetings and lectures we'll discuss the nature of the treaty and the counter-revolutionary settlement and the civil war in the south, and in very many respects the civil war and the reactionary imposition of partition in the north. But I would like to point out and say very quickly that General Macready, who signed the ceasefire with De Valera, told the British government that their choices in July 1921 were all out or get out. Complete military repression because they couldn't suppress the Republican and popular campaign, or get out of Ireland. Now, obviously, the Sinn Féin and the revolutionary movement didn't understand or fully appreciate this at the time, but it is something of a blind spot, really, which confirms the tragedy of subsequent events. So we go through and we'll talk about very briefly about what this democratic mandate was. And this is actually De Valera's by-election victory speech in Ennis. But the Sinn Féin manifesto, which they stood on in 1918, gave the Irish people a very, very definite choice between the full sunlight of freedom or the shadow of base imperialism. Between the Republic proclaimed in 1916 or a type of Redmondite base neo-imperialism. And anyone who has any sort of understanding of contemporary Irish politics will see the parallels, because we have a neo-Redmondism dominates politics in Ireland. This is essentially to come to terms with the neoliberal hegemon, to be like a flea on the back of the wolf in terms of neoliberalism, and to carve your niche out really at the master's table, and to be one of the most supine and subservient states in the West. But there's another tradition within Ireland who have solidarity with all oppressed peoples who are struggling for freedom, self-determination and independence. And that is the type of political tradition which is called republicanism or Fenianism, and which was given expression and support by the majority of the Irish people in 1918. And it's no mistake then that De Valera wore his volunteer uniform from 1916 when he got elected to County Clare, and he subsequently ramped home in 1918. The problem with this is that while that man in the middle, Woodrow Wilson, who, despite his reputation as a great liberal, was an inveterate racist who thought that The Birth of a Nation, the Ku Klux Klan movie, was the greatest film ever made, his 14 points about self-determination are meant to underpin the post-war consensus. But the two men on either side of him, Lloyd George, who's closest to us, the son of a Welsh Baptist shoemaker who claims the greasy pole of British politics and eventually ends up having tea with Hitler in Berchtesgaden, and George Clemenceau, the Tiger, their empires actually expand because of the Paris Peace Conference. And when the Irish delegation go to Paris, they get the same reception as the Vietnamese delegation under Ho Chi Minh and others, like the Algerian delegations, get. They are ignored. They are safely ignored. So the imposition of self-determination against Germany and Austria and the Turkish Empire and the Russian Empire was full of hypocrisy. It was to weaken imperial rivals. It was not a democratic principle, because the two principal empires, the three, if you count America as an empire because of the Monroe Doctrine and their domination of the Western Hemisphere, these people weren't interested in self-determination. The imposition of partition in Ireland is an attempt to undermine self-determination. What we talk about here then is the Declaration of Independence of the First Dáil has to be understood within the context of a popular, democratic, republican mobilisation, which is always under the shadow of British suppression. And we only need to look at the sparse numbers who turned up for the first meeting, and 34 of them, the majority of the people who were elected as Sinn Féin candidates, were Fearghal MacBhloscaidh, imprisoned by the foreigners. Right? So the same day that this happens, Dan Bean and Sean Tracy kill a Catholic Gaelic-speaking policeman in Kerry when they're reading for Gaelic night. And the nature of the commemoration is that this is a terrible tragedy. And personally, it was a terrible tragedy for MacDonald that this policeman was killed. Okay? But typically, this is mentioned and personalised to counterbalance or to make an equivalence between both sides or both types of violence, when in fact there is no real equivalence. The Irish people, the policeman was a member of the Crown Forces. The Irish people had democratically rejected British interference in Ireland. Right? The British had killed Thomas Ashe 2 years previously through force feeding. They had imprisoned over half of their elected representatives. But in the sort of this, sepia-coloured reincarnation or commemoration of history, an equivalence, a false equivalence, is drawn by those who were on the side of imperial oppression and those who fought against imperial oppression. But the people who lived in Ireland at the time made no false equivalence. In fact, even though the IRA were engaged in a campaign, particularly, they try and kill Lord French at the end of 1918 in the Phoenix Park. They're engaged in a campaign of military resistance against imperial oppression because the British have banned a democratic underground government in the autumn. The British are imposing coercion, and in spite of all this, you will see on the map on the right-hand side, 80% of the people of Ireland in the local and rural and urban elections of 1920 vote for parties pledged to the Republic. Less than 15% vote for parties pledged to partition. And this is the key democratic aspect. There was popular support for this military campaign. There was no popular enthusiasm for violence. People didn't want to have their towns burnt in reprisals by the Black and Tans. People didn't want to lose members of their family, and people didn't want to take other people's lives. Okay? But as Padraig Pearse says, there are worse things than killing, and one of them is slavery. There's worse things than violence, and one of them is slavery. And the proposition was put to the Irish people, well, you're all fine and dandy, you can vote for a republic, but you aren't going to get it, and what are you going to do about it? And that is where it's clear that the vast majority of people backed this campaign for a republic, and that there was popular legitimacy for the IRA campaign. Okay? So Sinn Féin won 72 out of 125, or out of 127 councils in Ireland, urban councils. You can see the statistics there. I'll not go through them exhaustively. In the intervening period between the urban council elections in 1920 in January and June 1920, there's a mass one-day strike by organised labour for trade union and volunteer prisoners are on hunger strike because of mass arrests. And this initially breaks British coercion. This demonstrates mass support for this republic and for these prisoners. Right? In the June rural election, Sinn Féin Labour won 80% of the vote. Sinn Féin won 40% of the rural vote in Ulster, and 55% of the vote in Ulster is anti-partitionist. Between January and June, 70% of the population vote for parties pledged to the Republic. Only 12% vote for unionism. And 28 out of the 32 counties pledge allegiance to the Dáil. The left-leaning Daily Herald of Britain said that this invisible republic exists in the hearts of the men and women of Ireland and wields a moral authority which all the tanks and machine guns of King George cannot command. And this is a key point, because what happens is that faced with this, twice being told that the majority of people in Ireland demanded self-determination, rather than seceding to a principle which they claimed to have implemented, the freedom of small nations, they said they fought a war for it, the British actually ramped up coercion. And this coercion is ramped up in Belfast because the results of the urban council elections in January indicated that Ulster Union was losing its grip in the city. And it wasn't losing its grip to nationalism, the Irish Party or the Sinn Féin. It was losing its grip to anti-partitionist, anti-sectarian Labour, who voted in 12 councillors. And it's as a result of this that the unionist leadership, Carson and Craig and Fred Crawford, in cahoots with a yellow union called the Ulster Unionist Labour Association, essentially organised a pogrom for the 21st of July 1920, after Carson gives his terrible speech at the Orange Field in Finaghy. And there's the expulsion of 10,000 workers, including Protestant socialist trade unionists, the expulsion of 25,000 people from their homes, and there's some of them in the picture, these are Belfast refugees. And over the period of the Irish Revolution and counter-revolution, it's estimated that 50,000 people left the 6 counties. Now, this is a piece of our history that is not prominently exposed within Irish historiography. In fact, Irish historiography concentrates on the very exceptional examples where it appears that there's a suggestion that Protestants were targeted by the IRA in the South. And the work of Peter Hart is infamous because of this. But nothing like what happens in Belfast happens anywhere else in Ireland, except when the British Crown forces impose a direct policy of reprisal against the civilian population in the course of the guerrilla war. But even then, it doesn't reach the scale that it reached in Belfast. Belfast was the most violent place in Ireland during the revolutionary period, but no one talks about it, because we now live in this era where partition's okay. But the imposition of partition was based on a type of reactionary proto-fascist imperialism, and it served the interests of the British state, to the extent that the British state actually turned the pogromists into the Ulster Specialist Constabulary and funded them to the tune of £6 million during a post-war depression, when all the Catholics and the trade unions have been expelled from the industries of Belfast, and you need to have a B-man card or a C-man card to get a job in Horn for workmen's and clerks. And at the same time that they do this, they introduce the Restoration of Order in Ireland Act, which suspends all individual liberties, and they send in the auxiliaries. And there's Lord French and Macready examining the auxiliaries. And why do they do this? Well, Winston Churchill tells Parliament why they do this. He says he wasn't going to grant a republic to a miserable gang of cowardly assassins like the human leopards of East Africa. Now, but don't worry, we're in good company, because he, at the same time, as the Colonial Secretary, he proposed the use of chemical weapons against recalcitrant Arabs in Mesopotamia or Iraq. So our struggle fitted into struggles of people across the empire who struggled for self-determination and an end to imperial oppression. And this equation between these people and criminals and the people in authority as the agents of civilization is something that we hear every day. The criminalization of people fighting for independence and a more just society, we are quite familiar with. So November is the bloodiest month. It begins obviously just prior to November with the iconic death of Terence McSweeney, who says those who inflict the most will not prevail, but those who can suffer the most. Gavin Barry is hung on the 1st of November, and it's on the 9th of November, and this is incredible, that Lloyd George gives a speech saying that we have murder by the throat. This murder campaign, this criminal conspiracy, we have them by the throat. So he wasn't right. It's after this then that you have the events of Bloody Sunday, and then after Bloody Sunday, you have the ambush at Kilmichael, where the IRA, rather than this desperate gang of beshevelled working class criminal scum, are actually a well-disciplined guerrilla organisation who take the auxiliaries on in the field and defeat them comprehensively. But these people aren't criminals. They're ordinary, typically working class, or the stock of small farmers, who are engaged in a guerrilla campaign to achieve a democratic future for the country. And many of them are infused with socialist ideas about a cooperative commonwealth or a workers' republic. This is not the message that you get from historians. The message from historians is that republicanism generally, and I've written an article on this in the Irish Studies Review called Objective Historians, Irrational Fenians and the Bewildered Herd. And it concentrates on the work of Fitzpatrick, Paul Bew and Roy Foster, and to an extent Peter Hart. But Peter Hart is the most prominent example of someone who, and we can be quite clear about this now, manipulated the evidence in order to provide an anti-Republican analysis, where, surprise, surprise, in the early 1990s, he's writing that there was a sectarian tit-for-tat campaign in Cork, the same time that the media were claiming that there was a sectarian tit-for-tat campaign in Belfast and across the north. What this revisionism does is it completely decontextualizes Republican agency. It says that Republican agency is completely irrational, that the British are the rational agent in the conflict. In fact, they might do the odd, ham-fisted mistake, but it's always well-intentioned. That the Unionists are only acting out of fear of nationalist aggression, and that the Republicans are completely mad and irrational. That being a Republican is really insane, and that the Republicans are somehow uniquely violent within the context of Irish history. That actually the other agents aren't violent at all. That republicanism is some type of irrational ideology committed to the idea of violence. Now, this is pretty rich from the biggest empire in the world that was completely based on coercion and violence. But what is this characterization of these Republicans? So those people in the previous slide, this is what Fitzpatrick has to say, echoing his former PhD candidate student. Hardy says, adulterers, homosexuals, thinkers, beggars, ex-servicemen, Protestants, there were many dangerous and potentially lethal labels for Ireland's inhabitants in the revolutionary period. This is the reduction of a struggle for national self-determination based on a manipulation of the source base and the evidence to demonise the people who engaged in a campaign for national self-determination. Right? The problem with this is it wasn't true. And Lionel Curtis, who was the leading civil servant in Dublin Castle at the time, said so. He said, Protestants in the South do not complain of persecution on sectarian grounds, Protestant farmers are murdered as not by reason of their religion, but rather because they are under suspicion as loyalists. The distinction is a fine but a real one. And Billenberg's analysis of Cork has demonstrated this. The IRA campaign was not sectarian. The ideology which underpinned republicanism is the only anti-sectarian ideology in Irish history, with republican socialism as an adjunct. Irish constitutional nationalism, particularly in its Hibernian manifestation, is sectarian. And it's at best non-sectarian, but it's definitely not anti-sectarian. And unionism is based, in essence, it's a sectarian ideology. The people who employed and manipulated sectarianism in Ireland were the Ulster Unionists and the British state, who give them carte blanche and unconditional support. But you're not going to read any of that in many of the mainstream historical accounts of the period. This is what the British campaign involved. My own analysis of Tyrone confirms this. The IRA engaged in a guerrilla campaign typically against military combatants. The British and then their loyalist proxies in the north and Tyrone responded through widespread reprisals. And this is Cork City. After the Black and Tans, after attacked in a military engagement, go in and burn the town, gut the town. And then Harmore Greenwood, the Irish Chief Secretary, a supposed Liberal, blames the people of Cork for burning their own town in order to blame the British authorities. Right? So black propaganda is not a novel phenomenon. It probably gets to us a lot quicker nowadays than it did 100 years ago. But what did these guerrilla fighters, what did these people struggling for national independence, how did they characterise their struggles? You know, there's a great tendency now to abandon the core principles of republicanism, that the Irish people have a unitary right to self-determination, that republicanism is an expression of the radical humanism of the Enlightenment within a colonial context. And some people who call themselves Republicans have abandoned all this, but they love dressing up at Easter time in costumes of 100 years ago and reveling in the fact that they were engaged in political violence. The people who actually engaged in political violence thought, this is not a good thing. This is something that you have to do, but it's not something that it's a tactic. It's not an essential element of what it is to be a Republican. And Barry himself said, I am not one of these who believe that war is a glorious thing. The First World War taught me that. And there is nothing romantic about war. The only war that I can justify to myself is a war of liberation. And that is the chief distinction. And this is why you can't make an equivalence between British forces and Republican forces in Ireland during the Con War. Because the Republican forces were engaged in a military campaign in defence of self-determination and democracy. And the British and the Loyalist forces stood full square against democracy and self-determination. Northern Ireland wasn't created because the Unionists deserved self-determination. It was created in order to subvert self-determination. Neither the British nor the Unionists believed in self-determination because it completely undermined the entire British Empire, the concept. George Fuchs, who was the leading propaganda officer in Dublin Castle, said that the rebels, as they were called, breached the laws and customs of war, wherein conflict between white men should be carried out in a sportsmanlike manner and not like fights between savage tribes. And there's the Black and Tans there to the side. Now that's David Lowe's very famous Colonel Blimp, and you would see the true comparison really that he makes between the way that the British Empire is treating the people of Ireland and the people of India in this period. That Britain claimed to have fought the First World War in defence of small nations, that the greatest recruiting agent for the British Army in India was Mahatma Gandhi, but that the Indian people ended the war, denied self-government, and given the Amritsar massacre, where General Dyer slaughters innocents, and where leading British politicians defend him in Parliament, and where Edward Carson contributes to his legal fees. Okay? And you think about what someone like Fuchs is talking about, and this racist analysis is used against the Irish as well. I think of Pontecorvo's The Battle of Algiers, whenever the FLN leader is asked a question by a French journalist, how can you justify putting bombs in baskets and blowing up Pied Noir cafes in Algiers? And he says, well, you give me the planes and the tanks and the guns, and we'll give you the baskets. So this is an asymmetric campaign fought with popular democratic support against the greatest imperial power of the age. And it's also a blueprint for people across the empires struggling for their own freedom and self-determination. It's not something, I think, that we should glory in the fact that people were using political violence, but it's something that needs to be defended because it strikes at the heart, not only of what was going on 100 years in the world, but the nature of neoliberalism and global empire in the 21st century as well. So these are two children from Dublin with tricolour celebrating the truce of 1921. And unfortunately, they're celebrating in the false expectation that a 32-county republic with the Declaration of Independence and the democratic programme underpinning it are going to be established. And it wasn't. So the decade of centenaries and this idea about commemoration cannot be reduced down to some sort of, Tourism Ireland video where Bono and all these people are put forward. There was an unfulfilled revolution in Ireland. It doesn't necessarily have to be fulfilled through another town war. I hope there's never another town war in Ireland. But it can only be fulfilled whenever Irish people get to grips with the reality of what that war was about. And it was a conflict against domination and imperialism, and in that respect, it was justified. Domination and imperialism have not disappeared. The Irish people and the Irish political establishment to a large extent have made their bed and they're lying in it. But the Irish people have a proud tradition of challenging, jumping into bed with imperialists, with having solidarity for the oppressed. And that, I think, is the great vista in front of us. It's what pathway do we take? And Padraig Pearse said the same thing at the beginning of the First World War. He says, ugly, volunteers, there are only two paths. Ireland alone or Ireland and the British Empire. Are we going to be imperial lackeys? Or are we going to strive to fulfil the ideals and ambitions of republicanism, not only 100 years ago, but 200 years ago, when Wolfe Tone sought to sever the connection with England and to unite Catholics, Protestants and dissenters and stand up for the men of no property?
Gurcéad maigad argal as an Craobh cumsachach agus spragul sin. That was fantastic. The amount of information, Fearghal, that you managed to cram into that 15 or 20 minutes or whatever it was incredible. And it's a perspective, I suppose, that's badly needed in the coming period, when we're going to have a lot of establishment proto-analysis, shall we say, of that period 100 years ago, leading up to the War of Independence, and indeed the War of Independence and some of the details around that itself. So that's the period we're coming into. That's why we thought it was important to hear a perspective such as yours, in order to first of all, better inform us exactly what the dynamics of the period were, and to draw our own lessons and conclusions about how that has shaped the Ireland we live in today, and what we can potentially do to make that Ireland a better place, and to tidy up some of the loose ends, I suppose, to put it flippantly, that have been left behind by our history and our struggle against imperialism. Of course, imperialism has taken on some new manifestations since the early part of the 20th century. And I would like to discuss some of those aspects with our guest panel here today. Welcome to our panel discussion. With me today are three political activists. Two are elected and two non-elected. We have Eddie Glackin. Eddie Glackin has been a member of the Communist Party of Ireland since 1969 and currently sits on the party's national executive. A native of Dublin, he's now resident in County Donegal. Councillor Barry Monteith comes from Dungannon, County Tyrone. Barry is an independent Republican and was first elected to Dungannon Council, now Mid-Ulster Council, in 2001. Clare Daly is an MEP and activist, a member of the European Parliament for the Dublin constituency since July 2019. She's a member of Independence for Change, which is part of the European United Left, Nordic Green Left group in the European Parliament. Welcome to you all, and thank you very much for joining our discussion here today. Our discussion is based on the pretext of the presentation that you've just heard from Dr. Fearghal MacBhloscaidh on the War of Independence. a just war. Fearghal makes the case very strongly and sets it in its wider international context. I'm going to bring the panellists in to ask them, first of all, what their initial reaction was to the presentation that Fearghal has just made, and maybe to point out one or two aspects of the discussion that they found either challenging or interesting or noteworthy for any other reason. I'll bring you in first, Councillor Barry Monteith. What did you make of the presentation?
Excellent presentation, and like all of Fearghal's work, very well put together and very well argued. It'd probably be no shock to anyone. I would agree with the broad thrust and many points what Fearghal has said in relation to the issues of the Táin War. But I think it is worth highlighting that the oppressed in any struggle are always held to a higher standard than the oppressor. And it always seems to be the case that the oppressed people who resist colonialism or empire, they're held to a higher standard of justification for any attempt to remove that oppression than the oppressor ever is. So, Republicans in Ireland, for example, to give our own example, are always told that, that your struggle is not justified, armed struggle is not justified, your political agitation is not justified. But the oppressor was never asked to politically justify oppressing. The oppressor was never asked to politically to say, did they exhaust all political avenues before they invaded the country? So even the discussion around the justification of resistance to oppression is funneled through that colonial empire building mentality. And the reality of it is that Irish republicanism, as other struggles around the world, are held to a higher standard, and they're forced to justify every single action far more than the oppressor. And it comes through that lens, and it's important to highlight the fact that this is a legitimate struggle. The cause of Irish freedom is completely legitimate, and I go back to a Protestant rebel and one who was demonised for his sexuality or his alleged sexuality, was Casement, and he says, Ireland had wronged no man, injured no land, and sought dominion over no others, is treated among the nations of the world as a convicted criminal. And that is how the oppressor, that is how the empire, that is how Britain has continued to portray Ireland and our struggle for freedom as some sort of criminal conspiracy. And that demonisation continues today. Only yesterday we have Charlie Flanagan making a complaint to RTE because of the work done by families who bore the brunt of the British Empire and continue to bore the brunt of the British Empire right up to modern day in the actions of the Land Gang. And Charlie Flanagan, who had been a minister in the 26 counties, he never once called for an investigation into Dublin Monaghan bombings or any of those atrocities carried out the Land Gang. Now calls into impartiality from RTE. If RTE was to put on an annual programme whereby the RTE Philharmonic Orchestra fill the RDS or a venue in Dublin and play patriotic songs, and we all sing A Nation Once Again and fly tricolours and all that type of paraphernalia, it would never happen. Yet we're subjected to the BBC problems every year, Rule Britannia. So again, the empire holds itself to a different justification than what we're held to. And I think we need to always state that we should not always say, yes, you have to put forward your argument for unification, for freedom, but we should not always follow what the oppressor tells us to do, set their agenda. They're always calling on us to justify, without the same need for those to justify backwards. And I think that's what we always do. They talk about where the justification comes from proclamation, from the dead generations from which we receive our nation.
Thank you, Barry. And indeed, that's going to be the pertinent debate over the next 12 to 18 months. That's going to be played out, I imagine, on television screens and on radio stations, or wherever political discussions take place. And I think it's vital that the establishment narrative does come under scrutiny and is challenged indeed from all quarters, because while it has been the dominant narrative, I think there's a new sense among people that the establishment narrative no longer holds good for working class people who have little or no faith in anything that they say. I'm going to bring in Eddie Glackin next.
Thanks, Craobh. Well, as you said, I've read and heard Fearghal's talk previously, and I was enjoying it very much. Very precise, systematic historian. He doesn't leave much room for argument when he's finished stating his case. The things that struck me particularly about the presentation today is that Fearghal hitting a number of key points. First of all, the whole question of legitimacy and the central themes, the Tan War, a just war, and demonstrated really using, if you like, the old standard establishment democratic rules, looking at the electoral performance of Republicans in the general election in the British general election in 1920 or 1980, and the subsequent local elections. And in every one of those elections, Sinn Féin, initially before the war started, and subsequently in the middle of the war, Sinn Féin received an overwhelming mandate from the people, from the ordinary people of this country, and a vast majority of the people of this country. A mandate, I would suggest, and I would like any historian to correct me on this, but I would suggest no other political party in the history of this state has received a similar mandate in electoral terms. So that's the first thing about the legitimacy of a people fighting for their own independence, a principle which every nation claims to uphold, as long as, of course, they're not the ones who are holding you in bondage in the first place. Like the nonsense of Britain saying they were going to fight for the freedom of small nations in World War I. And as somebody said, they refused to give independence to the one country whom they could have granted it by the stroke of a pen. And said that they went to war, millions of lives were lost. And at the end of that war, the big empires, Britain and France, subsequently joined by the United States, emerged even stronger from that war. I think, again, Fearghal touched on that very clearly in the context of his presentation. The second thing, apart from the question of legitimacy, question of imperialism, which very few contemporary historians pay any attention to. They think imperialism is something to do with gunboats sailing up some river in East Africa or India and firing off shots at recalcitrant natives. And they just reduce imperialism to political and military dimensions. But Ireland was seen at the time as paramount anti-imperialist struggle in global terms. And it was very clearly understood by everybody, not least the British imperialists, as an anti-imperial struggle. There were latter-day politicians and historians tried to pretend it was something otherwise. Some bunch of crazy tribes in Ireland who just couldn't get on without the civilising influence of Mother England. So I think those things are made strongly from Fearghal's talk, the legitimacy of the struggle and the resorting to arms, which was never the first choice of any fighters for Irish independence or freedom. Throughout history, violence always came from the oppressor. And the second thing that was putting it clearly in the context of an anti-imperial struggle. One of the questions I think that needs to be looked at over the next year and all these celebrations and commemorations is what people understand by imperialism. It's not simply about gunboats and uniforms and armies fighting. There's a reason why colonialists and imperialists invade and occupy countries, and that's to extract the wealth from those countries and from those societies and keep down those who would attempt to prevent them doing that. That's the way imperialism always was, and that's the way it is today. And if today they use fellas with checkbooks rather than gunboats and armies, the object of the exercise is the exact same. The beneficiaries of it are the exact same. And some of these wonderful latter-day so-called historians that Fearghal referred to, I would like to ask them a question. Where did this imperialism go after World War I? British Empire, French Empire, they all just apparently disappeared because nobody talks about them anymore. Now, I must have blinked and missed when they ceased to be empires. But again, I'd compliment Fearghal on his presentation, the question there. There are many, many issues, and over the next year they're going to emerge. Something that I think is particularly important is looking at all these things in the context of class and ongoing class conflicts and struggle. As James Connolly said in relation to Marxism, he said it was the key of history in his great book, Labour in Irish History. And unless you look at Irish or any other history in the context of that, the struggle between contending classes, unless you apply that test to it, You can't understand it. It is an irrational bunch of cowboys fighting each other over bits of flags and notions and documents and paper. It goes deeper than that. And I think that's something that has to be brought out in the discussions over the next year.
Thank you, comrade. And our third guest, as I introduced her a few moments ago, Clare Daly. Clare, I come from the same part of the world as Fearghal and indeed Barry, and the War of Independence for us, I suppose, was framed around the political struggle that was ongoing while we were growing up, and there was obviously, to us, it was portrayed as there was some degree of continuity in the struggle that was taking place around Tyrone in the 70s, 80s and 90s, and there was deemed to be a lineage stretching back to the War of Independence. I suspect you growing up weren't presented with the War of Independence in that light at all. Do you want to share maybe your memories of how the War of Independence was portrayed to you at school vis-a-vis the conflict in the north? But I'd like you also maybe to make whatever comments that stood out for you.
I struggle to remember anything of what I learned in school, which I think is a good method to have, because I don't think anybody learned an accurate history really in either of our education systems. But in terms of Fearghal's reprogramming, which, you know, isn't a reprogramming, but is an actual historical account of what actually happened. I certainly can't add to the facts in that, because he's put them forward so well and they're indisputable. And I think we have to stand over that. But I think what we are right to do, and why this event is important, is that we are entering, well, we're in the middle of a massive period of revisionism. Now, the establishment like to talk about fake news, disinformation. They're the words of the day. But revisionism is a tactic used by the political establishment in order to try and claim the past so that they can continue to dictate the future. And it's really important then that the balance is put right and an accurate history is put forward, because I've no doubt that what Fearghal said, that we are facing into a distortion of what actually happened and a continuation of the attempts to remove the legitimacy of the Republican struggle in Ireland around the War of Independence, its broad outlook, in order to marginalise that opinion today on the one hand, and to bolster imperialism on the other. And I think it's very important for us to make that stand, if you like. And I suppose the bits that struck me in terms of Fearghal's presentation, I mean, and again, it's flipping the thing, isn't it? I mean, this period comes on the back of saturation coverage in terms of the distortion of World War I. And to me, the demonisation of the War of Independence is rooted in the rewriting of the celebration of World War I. And the irony that those who now would blame those who fought in the War of Independence for their violence are the ones who actually stand over the mass slaughter of people in the trenches in World War I, but they have their absolutist pacifist position now. But they're the same people who are championing NATO invasions in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in all the rest of it. Violence doesn't matter there when you're slaughtering, you know, millions of ordinary people around the globe. It's irrelevant. But oh no, the violence of the War of Independence was unacceptable. So I think that's an important point that we have to keep coming back to. I think as well we have to say, why is this being done? And one of the things that I don't know kind of struck me, I don't particularly know why, but it's this sort of rabble, mad animal, you know, Republicans, indisciplined. It's part of another narrative which says that they're just irrational, they're sectarian, it's this toxic masculinity, it's their homophobia of the IRA, and it's this Celtic race theory. And maybe what people might want to comment is, because I think this is going to be written into it as well, is that these cliches and this revisionism is actually being seized upon by the far right to dress themselves up. So they're playing into the establishment's agenda and distorting it for themselves to say that they are so by taking symbols of Irish independence, of Republican struggle, what they're actually doing is trying to eliminate the internationalism and the anti-imperialism that was actually at the heart of that struggle. So for me, this is really important, particularly when they've dressed up their mantra in Republican clothes to carry out a vicious racism. Then I think the job against immigrants and migrants in Ireland and so on, we see, the eviction during the pandemic in Dublin of a black family with people wearing Irish flags on their shirts and so on, just ridiculous stuff. So I think that narrative is going to be built in it as well, that there will be attempts by the establishment to seize on the far right seizing of this, to portray that the War of Independence was that, when it was actually a massive part of the struggle against global imperialism. And as the others have said, I think the other thing is what's not going to be brought out is the democratic mandate, that war was waged off the back of a massive democratic mandate. And we should remind ourselves that the imperialists of today don't care about democratic mandates at all, only when it suits them. And we'll see this now in the coming weeks when the government of Venezuela tries to have an election. They say, oh, it's not a democratically legitimate government, even though the people of Venezuela voted for it. So now the government work with practically every thread of the opposition, have an election where they've 107 parties ready to contest and 14,000 candidates ready to stand. And the European Union and the United States say, no, you're not ready for an election. You don't have a mandate to have even an election. So for them, democracy just means having an election as long as the right person wins, or somebody that they don't want to win, which shows the very limits of so-called democracy. And what was presented in Ireland was a programme which undoubtedly had the support of the people, and then that will could not be exercised without making the stand that had to be made. And I think there was there's no evidence to say there was any celebration of violence or anything like that. It was very much a reactive struggle in that way. So I think it's incredibly relevant. I think it's incredibly relevant in Ireland, in our stance around neutrality, for example, because, World War I, a lot of the socialist groups in Europe became very pacifist. Ireland's adherence to neutrality has never been pacifist. It's always been rooted in an anti-imperial struggle, if you like, and that's very much where it's anchored now. So I think that makes us a little bit different. So I think there's a huge amount to be learned from this, and I hope I think it'll be very educational for people to listen to Fearghal's talk.
Indeed, and as you point out, in how the debate with the revisionists plays out over the coming 12 months. That's a very interesting point you made, Clare, and it didn't immediately dawn on me that the far right moving now into military apparel or quasi-military apparel on the streets in Dublin fits in very neatly with that portrayal that we're going to get from the revisionists and from the establishment of recalcitrant Republicans and so on, anti-progressive and all of that. And it ties in quite neatly. So that's going to be fascinating how this plays out in the coming months, and indeed very threatening indeed for the people of Ireland. Eddie, you also made a point, and I just want to come back to it, in terms of the changing nature and face of imperialism. There's been, a very predominant focus on the role of British imperialism in Ireland. But we talk now about the triple lock that imperialism holds over the people of Ireland now. Both British, not only British imperialism and its occupation of part of the island, its ongoing occupation of part of the island, but also the influence of US imperialism, and increasingly so EU imperialism and its imperialist designs on Ireland. Now, there's been a shift in sections of the Republican movement in their attitude towards European imperialism. What do you think that means for the broader struggle going forward, the broader working class struggle, that while sections of the left and progressive republicanism are highly critical of European imperialism's role over the Irish economy, that other sections of the Republican movement seem to be making their peace to some extent with EU imperialism. Do you want to come back to that, Eddie, and then I'll bring maybe the others in on that as well?
Well, again, it comes back to the question of how you understand imperialism, or should I say, if you understand imperialism. Because I can imagine a lot of, if I may say so, Labour Party members and so-called liberals listen to your description of EU imperialism, and they'd be having a fit of the vapours. They'd be fainting with the horror of the idea that the EU was described as imperialistic rather than as some social democratic Disneyland that's there to entertain and look after us all in our dotage. It's ironic because, I mean, even those who would claim to be supporters of the initial idea of Irish independence, they hail the EU and its institutions and structures, such as the Commission, for example, such as the European Parliament. And the Parliament, which Clare knows very well and better than I do, Ireland had higher representation in Westminster under British rule than it has in Strasbourg now under so-called benevolent EU. So, I mean, using their own yardstick of how many people get elected and get voted and the number of votes they have then in decision-making assemblies, by that criteria alone, the Irish people were better off in their original empire than in the new empire. So just on that thing in terms of the validity of elections and everything else, it's a nonsense, this idea about the EU being some kind of protector of democracy. I mean, the legislation that's been brought in the EU in terms of anti-worker legislation, anti-trade union legislation, the build-up towards effectively almost like a war economy, a second war economy that they're trying to build up at the moment, as the powers that be in the EU tried to get what Kaiser Bill before World War I called a place in the sun. The EU was determined now as well to get their place in the sun and to compete with what they see as the existing power blocks. And again, if you don't look at the EU in that sort of context, if you just look at some of the outcomes, and for example, in this country, people would claim that the equal rights for women, to the extent that it exists in law, was something that was forced in by the EEC, and nothing to do with the struggles of many heroic women down the years, and of portraying the EU as some kind of a benevolent social democratic institution that doesn't have any venal or vested interest. It's a total caricature. And, you know, the idea of replacing one imperialism with another never struck me as a good deal. And I mean, they got rid of some of the trappings of British imperial rule in Ireland, and then you replace it with this. Frankly, I don't see the benefit. You referred there in your question, Gearoid, to the triple lock. I mean, the triple lock that affects the Irish people. There's the triple lock of British imperialism, of the EU imperialism, and increasingly the US imperialism, and the control and the power, that institutions such as the US Chamber of Commerce in Ireland have in trying to determine and shape government policy in the 26 counties. That is the triple lock of imperialism. And as I said, the fact that there's no gunboats and not necessarily soldiers walking up and down the street shooting at people, though of course we have our fill of that too. People need to understand that imperialism, it's class-based, it's about the big capitalist class, not just in Ireland, Britain, across the world. That's the forces that are represented by the EU, and we have to take up the struggle against them and stop kidding ourselves that the vestiges of these old empires have somehow become transmogrified in the paragons of virtue and progressive ideas. It's not true. That's the enemy, and we need to recognise the enemy.
Okay. Eddie, thank you. And before I go back to Clare in the belly of the beast, so to speak, Barry, it's not necessarily an easy sell trying to convince constituents in your part of the world that the EU, in its manifestation of imperialism, poses a serious threat to ordinary working people in Ireland in the same way that to our economic future as did British imperialism?
Yeah, it's right. I think the difficulty is it's all about language and how images or a message is put across. And we talked about it earlier about how the Empire and the British system puts its message across. But again, the EU has been very successful at portraying being European as equivalent to being in support of the EU. And I do believe there's an essential essence in the Irish people. They do believe that they're European and they're proud to be European. But the EU has framed that in order to be European, you must be a member of the European Union. So I think that dichotomy is a problem when you're trying to make the difference, because people don't, that isn't really evident among the body politic of the differentials between that. Also, the unique situation of what has went on here over the last number of years, whereby for a considerable section of the nationalist community in 6 counties, the EU was portrayed as some sort of guarantor of rights, of nationhood, and that type of thing. And that was a very deliberate, systematic, and very conscious decision, I would argue, by the Constitutional Nationalist Party at the time, the SDLP, and John Hume, the champion of all that. And any sort of scrap from the table, any factory that was opened, or any sort of minuscule attempt to provide jobs in working class areas was always portrayed through the narrative of this is the EU, especially when you see around Derry City in particular, but certainly other parts of the 6 counties as well, was that if it wasn't for the EU, you would have nothing. So I think it's going to be a difficult task then to withdraw that from people. But I think more and more people look at it and go, well, it isn't just the case that everything from the EU is good, and I think it's more and more apparent to people at the minute. I think one of the issues one of the people I would like to make reference to today, because we're talking about it, is Terence McSweeney. And Terence McSweeney, as we all know, today would have been his 51st day on hunger strike 100 years ago. And some of Terence McSweeney's writings are almost like looking into the future. And he's a very sometimes forgotten figure. He's remembered as a hunger striker, but his writings are very often forgotten. But some of the issues we're talking about, he very much warned of, and he talked about the future government of the Republic, that it must, and it's a great mantra for all of us, that the future government of the Republic must consider also the claims of those less powerful, but not less true. And that is the essence, I would have always argued, of what neutrality should be, of Ireland's position in the world. And he warned that a government that overrides the weak because it is safe as a tyranny. And tyranny is in the seed of all democratic governments of our time. And that's exactly true today as it was before. The attraction then for nationalists in Ireland, and bringing them in onto the curtilages and throwing the scraps at them, and it's been like an elastic band for Irish politics, where people that start as rebels end up as constitutional as any that went before. And the old Animal Farm stuff, you can't see a difference looking through the window. We even see things this week whereby our people get the murder of our innocent Irish people rubbed in their face on the following day, with photographs taken with the commander-in-chief of the very regiment that done it. And again, McSweeney warned of that. He talked about the invitation to garden parties at Windsor. He talked about lesser functions and free admission to festivals. And he talked about the era of no politics, when ideology disappeared. And he says, great is the no politics era where you can so quietly spike the guns of many's an old politician and keep them safe. And that is what the whole ideology is about, from the empire, from imperialism, is to take any radical thought, remove the radical thought, and take the person, and then use that person then to nullify radical thought among the body politic. And so the strength of the old warrior is sapped, and the web is so finely woven. And again, those are warnings from history. Those are warnings from 100 years ago, and they're as pertinent today as they were then. And they're very, very issues about what we need to do is push political education in educating and empowering people to know the difference and see their history. And Fearghal mentioned Tom Barry in this presentation. Tom Barry is a great example of it. Growing up, I read Tom Barry's book over and over and over. But in his opening pages, he talks about growing up and knowing more about the kings and queens and the lineage of the British throne than knowing about the history of his own country. And then he went on a progression then of self-education. And that's very deliberate. So that working class politics and revolutionary politics are not taught. They're not educated, and we're educated through a funnel. And I think that's the job of all of us as political activists, is to encourage people to investigate and explore their own socio-economic situation.
Thank you very much, Barry, and thank you for bringing us back to the point, I suppose, of today's presentation. I think that's why we're holding this weekend commemorative series of events, because we are going to use the Tan War and the subsequent Civil War to start drawing those parallels between the relationship of class forces within Ireland and indeed the imperial designs of others on Ireland. And to make comparisons between then and now, because many of the things, as you have pointed out, many of the lessons we draw from the War of Independence particularly are as pertinent and relevant in today's circumstances as they were then. Clare, I'll come back to you. We brought the issue, we're jumping back and forth between the Irish experience and of the war, and indeed our modern experience under EU, US and British imperialism. Would you like to address anything that either Eddie, any points that Eddie or Barry made?
I'd say they understated the scale of the EU domination and imperialism in terms of the Irish context. And I think Barry put it very well. Irish people are quite internationalist, actually, in our outlook. We like meeting people from different countries. We like travelling before COVID and all of that and having the crack. So our genuine fellow feeling for our other Europeans and beyond Europe has been exploited by those who want to make money and extend their own influence by saying that that good desire is embodied in the European Union, which I can absolutely tell you it isn't. The European Union is the opposite of solidarity. It is an institution which has been built in order to further the interests of capitalism and big business. The amount of lobbyists out here is utterly phenomenal. Hundreds upon hundreds of lobbyists based here for every industry. And you see it in the big players. And I think it is very relevant because we are going to hear a lot about the unruly, violent Republicans. But the people who are saying that are the people who've stood over a situation where for the first time now European Union money, the budget is going to be directly spent on the European Defence Fund. So direct money going into military expenditure now for the very first time out of the taxpayers' money of Europe. You know, they try and create this myth at home that Ireland, we got loads of money from the EU. And as Eddie says, sure, social progress, we're so thick. We'd never been able to do that for ourselves. We needed the European Union to come along and sort it out. That's not historically accurate. Irish people had struggled for many of the social gains and had, if you like, laid the basis for that in the early stages. So that bit's a myth. Getting all this money from Europe, that's a myth. They've got plenty of money from us, not least in the bank bailout, which would have cancelled out anything which was insisted upon by the European Union, not to mind robbing the fishery rights of the nation, which has been absolutely astronomical. But now it is the case that Ireland's a net contributor. So we're putting in €1 billion of Irish taxpayers' money every year goes in to fund the EU. And I think a lot of people don't realise that this myth that it's some big money giving out machine is still out there. But it's totally there to dominate the interests of European capital, and by that generally German and French capital, and be it their arms companies, their pharma companies, and so on. And it's similar to the European influence. And I think the points Fearghal made earlier about the unfinished nature of the revolution in Ireland and the fact that what we created was a sort of a conservative, supine sort of bend the knee to the masters sort of ruling class in Ireland. That's what we have. Like, I mean, it's embodied by the giving back the Apple money. I mean, could you really credit like that any government would be so upset at upsetting a multinational that hadn't paid practically anything that they would go and fight that we shouldn't get 13 billion euros to help, deal with our housing situation, our health crisis and so on. So imperialism and our bending the knee to that now is much more in the realm of absolutely EU neoliberal policy and certainly US imperialism from the point of view of the dominance of multinationals here. And I think in that sense, the lesson of going full circle is very important. And I think accurate historical information is important too, because, you know, the EU talks about being a benign influence, but it isn't. Like, if they say it brought peace to Europe, did you ever? There is no peace to Europe. There's poverty, there's a disconnect, there's people being left behind. Europe is, I read in the paper here this morning, preparing a boots on the ground in Libya situation. They're interfering in every part of the planet. They won't recognise the elections in Venezuela, the holding of that. They're undermining, and look, you could go on forever. People know the way it is. So that's why it is important that we will be accurate. While they go on about free democracy in other areas, their own countries here are ignoring that. They've created from Eastern Europe a pool of cheap labour for the West, and then a corrupt elite who pocket the money for themselves. And Ireland is in some ways no better to that. So we can learn an awful lot from our history in that regard.
Thank you very much, Claire. And that's before we even touch on the mass grave that we once called the Mediterranean Sea at this stage. I'm going to come back finally to Fearghal for a summary on what he's heard, but I think we might have time just to squeeze in one more round. I'm going to put a question. Who do you think, in political terms, certainly in parliamentary political terms, will benefit most from the forthcoming scrutiny on the period around the centenary of the War of Independence, and probably more importantly, the Civil War? Sinn Féin are currently riding high in the polls, and we know we've had the historic election where the two big right-wing parties could no longer command a majority of seats in the Dáil. Do you think there are going to be winners and losers after the centenary period of reflection in Irish politics in terms of today's modern parliamentary makeup? How do you see that playing out among the broader electorate? Do you think they'll draw any conclusions from the debate? And where do you think they'll go politically? Does the left stand to benefit in general, or do you think maybe Sinn Féin will mop that sentiment up? I'll go first to you, Barry, on that.
I think, you know, if you take whatever political capital there may be in any of these universities and the centenaries, I think we can't ignore that elephant in the room. Most of this is completely nullified by the current pandemic. And whatever, I would imagine Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael would have saw this as an opportunity with a bit of pageantry and big events in Dublin and stuff like that there over this year, next year, and London, the Civil War stuff as an opportunity to sort of relaunch themselves and try and steal a bit of the ground that Sinn Féin may have taken from them in relation to being the party of republicanism. Obviously, I would argue all three shouldn't be carrying that title, but I think we can't ignore that the coronavirus issue has most certainly taken that out of it. If you take the natural rise in patriotism there was in 2016 in Ireland, where people far and beyond any sort of political entity or political machinations, people did genuinely buy into the fact that this was a 100-year anniversary of the rising. You know, you had millions of people on the streets of Dublin, large attendances across Ireland at different events. You know, this year would have been, I'm not saying on the scale of 2016, but it most certainly would have been on a par. You know, you take the significant anniversaries. You've mentioned earlier Terence McSweeney. You have Kevin Barry's anniversary, you know, an iconic figure in Irish republicanism. The Bloody Sunday 100th anniversary here in November. These would have been massive events. You can take the GAA. The GAA previously had planned a massive event at Croke Park. You know, Croke Park would have been filled to the rafters for that. So I think the potential political capital is very hard to judge. And I don't think any of the parties who may have had a notion of taking a look at some of this and trying to gain on it will necessarily get the opportunity, because it's not even going to get through the media, if you know what I mean. If you take the media at the minute, there's very little of the 100th anniversary of the Tan War and not getting out there. So I think that's an issue. I think we also need to remember that who we want the winner to be. The winner should be the Irish people. The winner should be that we move forward and create the sovereign independent Irish Republic that we want. But we also must remember that sadly, it does seem to be far down the agenda of many of those who would proclaim it. whereby the people who are in power continue to do the job which they're put in power to do and given the scraps that people do. We mentioned terms for screening, we still have political prisoners in Ireland. We still have prison protests in Ireland. We still have people persecuted because of their political beliefs, whether it be Republican beliefs or left-wing beliefs. We have people, local people get persecuted. We saw the persecution of locals at the Shale to Sea issues, around the stuff around Shannon, Margaret Darcy, even the stuff going on in Tyrone here, and the anti-Mainan people, where the PSNI, RUC are being used by the powers that be to persecute local people fighting for their rights in their local area. So we should concern ourselves with making sure the Irish people are the winner, and that the political classes and chattering classes worry about what political gain the may or not got. I think there's an opportunity. I think Irish people want a positive message. I think if we can go forward a positive message, say, listen, take power back, take the power into your own hands, and let's free this country and do this properly and create the republic that we all aspire to.
Clare, I bring you in on this as well. You mentioned the rise of the far right earlier. Is there potential not just maybe for Sinn Féin and what would we deem to be some of the more progressive forces in Irish politics to benefit from reflection on the period 100 years ago? Are there also opportunities for the right there?
Yeah, I mean, look at, and I mean, I think Barry's point was very right in the sense that we have to factor in the COVID days, and this shutdown period, I suppose, has distorted everything. So in that sense, I don't think we can we have to be careful not to overstate what this commemoration period, the impact it's going to have on any sector of our society. But interestingly, I think you look at the commemoration and you look at the mishandling of the COVID situation by the Irish government, and it has actually given a bit of a niche as well to the far right in Ireland. They're certainly organising in a more open way because everybody else has been respectful of the guidelines and so on than anybody else is. So they are, I don't want to overstate their influence or anything like that, but I have no doubt that it will suit the political establishment in Ireland as well to allow the far right to claim that narrative, because it suits them to have a bunch of nuts going around blaming migrants or whatever, and while it serves the nice benefit of discrediting Republicans at the same time by the paraphernalia, so people don't look into their history. They say, oh, that was old, dark, conservative Ireland. I want something new and modern. So we do have to be careful, and I think there would be a move by the establishment to push that. I think in terms of, Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, and again, using it to rewrite history, they're not going to, I think their attempts to have the black and tan celebration there last year, the year before, sort of cut across that even there's a limit to their ability to revise history. People say, now come on now, we're not going that back that far. So I don't think they'll benefit from that rewriting. I think Sinn Féin would like to benefit and will certainly be trying to package their new modern clothes with the old message to say that they were the old face of republicanism and anti-imperialism, and this is the new face in nice sort of, whatever clothes for modern Ireland and women's rights and LGBTI and all that stuff. But how far it'll go with them, they're on a little bit, I don't know, because I do think that really the space to mobilise people more. I think they will get electoral gains out of this. I think with or without the centenary, they will anyway, but particularly because the opposition is so bad and there's nothing else there. And it is a good opportunity to look at the possibility now of next time round a government without either Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael in it, and that really will put it up to Sinn Féin. But if anybody thinks that the election of Sinn Féin, supported by a mishmash of the left, is going to be enough on its own, it obviously won't be. There needs to be, Irish people need to be mobilised for themselves. The type of examples Barry gave about people trying to reclaim their own areas, protect them from, be it, mining companies or whatever. Only by people empowering themselves in their own communities can we see the type of change that's necessary for people to alter their lives. And that's replicated throughout the European Union. We have people coming over on Monday from Bulgaria. You know, they've been 85 days on the streets of Bulgaria demanding that their government resign in the heart of the European Union. And the European Union are sending ambassadors over to Belarus to talk about, the violence in Belarus. And they say nothing about one of their member states involved in corruption and so on. So I think people everywhere have to take destiny into their own hands and go beyond elections and mobilise. Taking on board Barry's point that it's a bit more difficult at the moment with COVID, but ultimately there is no alternative. And I think there'll be a lot of space from that because this celebration or commemoration tees that up quite well.
Thanks, Claire. And finally, Eddie, before we go back to Fearghal, do you see any potential for the extra parliamentary left and indeed for groups like the Peadar O'Donnell Forum to be able to capitalise on the forthcoming centenaries and period of reflection?
I think there has to be such opportunities. We must create them. I don't have any faith in electoral changes to fundamentally shift things. Somebody once said rather cynically, but not totally without basis, that, you know, if voting changed anything, they'd make it illegal. And you have the musical chairs, the Tweedledum and Tweedledee, you have it over in the States now, you have it here with Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael historically. But I think there's a fairly significant recalibration going on in the political boys' network of the political parties that capitalism chooses to represent its interests in this country, both north and south. And I think that recalibration is taking place. I mean, God help us, when you see Fine Gael ministers talking about a united Ireland, you know the world is about to come to an end, or there's some changes brewing anyway. So, I mean, they will all jump on the bandwagon. There hasn't been a bandwagon ever created that Fianna Fáil won't jump onto. Fine Gael will do it as well. There is going to be a question, there goes my army, I must follow them. Peadar O'Donnell memorably wrote about this during the War of Independence, when the ordinary people were swinging in droves to Republicans at the Sinn Féin, as it then was. And he said all the shopkeepers and the businessmen and the barristers and solicitors decided, there go my customers, I better follow them. So they all jumped themselves into the so-called independence movement, and they were the ones then who destroyed the independence movement by imposing imperialist solution with partition and the Civil War. I said those changes are coming. We're also going to have, what makes it even more difficult if we talk about crystal ball gazing, Brexit and COVID. We have yet to see the profound impact that they're going to have in Irish society, north and south. Obviously not just in Ireland, but it's going to have a huge bearing on where we go here. And the parliamentary thing, I think the moves are there already to go up Sinn Féin. You know, in the absence of military struggle, the chosen weapon of capitalism is ruling by consent, and it's about manufacturing consent through the media, through TV and education system. And what they do with disgruntled people, disgruntled children, like Sinn Féin has been for them down the years, they co-opt them. They incorporate them into the system, civilise, educate them, give them a new suit of clothes, and then say, now play the game and you're all right. They haven't quite got to that stage yet with Sinn Féin. I sometimes think, and I don't mean to be insulting to members of Sinn Féin, but they're like Fianna Fáil light. If you look at where Fianna Fáil was in 1926, they were actually making more radical noises than Sinn Féin are now. But then you look where Fianna Fáil ended up. I'm not saying Sinn Féin are going to go to the same place. There's a broad democratic base of active members there, and hopefully their influence will come to bear. And that's where I think is the key thing. As Claire said, and as Barry said, it's not about the political parties in Dála. They're simply a reflection of what's going on. Peadar O'Donnell memorably described the proceedings of Dála as looking at monkeys in the superstructure. I think it's a wonderful expression, and it's exactly what they are. They're doing what they're told. They make the odd noises about jumping up and down like a bunch of monkeys in the zoo, but they won't change anything fundamental. It'll come back to the ordinary people to do something. This was shown, as Barry said, the 1916 centenary celebration. One of the best things about that to me was see young people, for the first time, discovering their own history. And the history is a battlefield. It's a contested area. And to me, the greatest outcome of this centenary period would be if the ordinary people of Ireland, especially young people, take ownership of their own history. I know it's a cliche, but reclaim a history. You can't say reclaim it because they never had it in the first place, but they need to claim it now and say this is our history, it's the history of our people, and we want to shape our country and the world in a way that will suit our interests and not those of our masters, be they in London or Brussels or Washington.
Thank you very much indeed, Eddie. And I think that neatly brings us back to Fearghal, who has sat very patiently throughout the discussion. Fearghal, I'm sorry I didn't bring you in any earlier, but would you like to wrap up for us before I say thanks to our panellists? Do you want to give some observations on the discussion that you've heard over the last half an hour, 40 minutes?
Yeah, very good discussion. And I think the point that I would make about the commemoration is, a dates on calendars won't change anything. All the commemoration will do will provide an atmosphere. Mark says history changes nothing in and of itself. It's man, real corporeal man who changes history. He should have said people, include women in that. But so it's what the commemoration can do is it can provide an atmosphere in which people can reassess the present in terms of the past. As Larkin and Connie would have said, the great only appear great because we are on our knees, and we appear hopeless because we think that the neoliberal hegemon has it all stitched up. And I might add that coming from the north, I think transformismo, as Gramsci would have called it, has happened Sinn Féin already. I wouldn't have any doubts when you're ringing the bell of the New York Stock Exchange with Ian Paisley, you're not in favour of a socialist revolution. So unfortunately, I think to all intents and purposes, Sinn Féin are co-opted, and they've fulfilled the role of becoming the centre-left element of the political establishment in the South, which is a great shame because the people who are voting for them and those activists and people I know and friends of mine who are activists in Sinn Féin are going and giving their heart and their soul to this. And, you know, they might end up eating at the dinner table in the farmhouse with Napoleon in the end. So, as Barry says. But history in and of itself will change nothing. But we have to have hope, because why did the War of Independence or the Tom War happen? First of all, it happened because of a conjunction of global political forces. It happened because of material forces in Ireland, class antagonism, which was accentuated by a global cataclysm, the end of La Belle Epoque. It happened because of the First World War. And before 1916, Republicans and left-wing activists were all nutcases. Oh my goodness. This little echo chamber today. It's within the context of changing material system or circumstances and conditions, both local and global, that Marx's mold re-emerges. And the Sinn Féin revolution was not about electoralism, and it wasn't about militarism. It was about a general upsurge of popular mobilization, and that is the secret. The pathway, the thing that Republicans were presented with in 1994, 1998 was a false dichotomy. It was, you can either have electoralism or you can have militarism, but they're both blind alleys. They're only aspects of what has to happen for systemic change to take place, and that's a general mobilization of the people. And in that respect, the ideology of socialist republicanism or Republican socialism acts as a means by which this generation can understand their own conditions and affect real change. But it will only be real change if it's from a grassroots upsurge. It's then whether or not we can learn the lessons that our history offers in terms of finally toppling the political establishment that acts as the mouthpiece for capital in Ireland. So that's how I would try and tie the thing up, is that the ideals of ordinary working class people for a fairer, more just society and for real human freedom and an end to alienation and capitalism, perhaps the conditions for that its achievement weren't right 100 years ago. Lenin and Trotsky might have thought they were right, but perhaps history has proven them wrong. The great challenge of this generation is to re-articulate those ideas to change circumstances, because we are now in the midst of another global cataclysm. The kaleidoscope is shaken, and we don't know what way it's going to settle. And as a Republican who, believes that his own agency or their own agency should contribute to a civic nation and the general benefit of everyone, not just in Ireland, but globally and of solidarity internationally, it's up to us then to try and make sure that when the dust settles, that a fairer and better society is the end result, not like it was 100 years ago.
Fearghal, both for your presentation and for your comments, which, as usual, are highly erudite and pierce to the core of what we're about. Okay, all that remains for me to do, folks, on behalf of the Peadar O'Donnell Socialist Republican Forum, is to thank Eddie Glackin in Donegal, Fearghal MacBhloscaidh in Belfast, Clare Daly over there in Brussels, and Councillor Barry Monteith in Dungannon. I've really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks ever so much for all your time today, and I hope everyone enjoys the debate as much as I did. Gur míle maith.